In a civilization built on the absolute authority of men, there existed 6 women who answered to no one. No father, no husband, no guardian. In a legal world where every Roman woman was classified as the property of a male relative from birth to death, transferred from father to husband like land or livestock, never permitted to act as an independent legal entity, these 6 women stood entirely outside that architecture. They owned property in their own names. They traveled through the streets of Rome in a carpentum, a ceremonial carriage, preceded by a lictor, the same official escort granted to the highest magistrates of the Republic. When they walked through a crowd, the crowd moved. When they attended the games, the best seats in the arena were theirs. When a condemned man was being led to his execution and happened to cross their path, they could stop the procession with a word and send him home free. 6 women in the most powerful empire on earth, possessed of a status so extraordinary that even the emperor was expected to show them deference. They were the Vestals, the Vestal virgins, the sacred priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth and the eternal flame, whose temple stood at the heart of the Roman Forum and whose cult was considered so fundamental to the survival of Rome that the city could not, in the Roman theological imagination, continue to exist without them. For a civilization that gave women nothing, this sounds like everything. It was not everything. It was a cage, more gilded, more elaborately constructed, and more psychologically sophisticated than the cage that held every other woman in Rome, but a cage nonetheless. One whose walls, once you learned to see them clearly, were more terrifying than the walls that confined anyone else in the ancient world. The forbidden archives are open. At the center of the temple of Vesta, a fire burned. It had been burning, according to Roman tradition, since the founding of the city itself. Since Romulus drew the sacred boundary of Rome in the earth and a civilization began. Through the reigns of kings, through the birth and crisis and expansion of the Republic, through the civil wars that destroyed the Republic and produced the Empire, through all of it, that fire had never gone out. It was Rome made visible, Rome made elemental. The theological assurance, renewed every moment of every day by its continued burning, that the city endured, that the gods had not withdrawn their favor, that the empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia remained intact. The Vestals kept it burning. This was their primary duty, their most fundamental obligation, the task around which every other aspect of their lives was organized. They tended the flame in rotating watches. They fed it. They protected it from the wind and the rain that came through the open dome of the temple. They ensured, through constant, vigilant, unceasing attention, that the symbol of Rome's eternal life never faltered. If the fire went out, the theological consequences were immediate and devastating. An extinguished flame was not merely a practical problem to be solved with a match. It was a sign, a divine signal that something had gone wrong at the most fundamental level, that the goddess had withdrawn, that the covenant between Rome and its protecting deities had been broken, that the city was vulnerable in ways that no army could address. The punishment for allowing the flame to die was a public flogging administered by the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, in darkness, behind a curtain, a humiliation designed to be both physically brutal and psychologically annihilating. A Vestal who failed in the most basic duty of her office was stripped of the dignity that defined her existence and beaten like a slave, in secret, so that the shame of it could not even be processed publicly but had to be carried privately, invisibly, in the body that had failed its sacred obligation. And that was merely the punishment for negligence. For the sin the Roman world considered far worse, the punishment was something else entirely. A girl was selected to become a Vestal between the ages of 6 and 10. The Pontifex Maximus would choose from the daughters of Rome's most respectable families. inspecting candidates with a thoroughness that reduced children to checklists of acceptable qualities, selecting the one whose appearance and family history and physical condition most closely matched the requirements of the sacred office. The selected girl was taken from her family immediately. The legal bond between father and daughter, which in Roman law was absolute and lifelong, was severed on the spot. She became, from that moment, a ward of the state and the goddess. She would serve for 30 years. 10 years learning. 10 years practicing. 10 years teaching the next generation. After 3 decades, she would be released, middle-aged, legally independent, theoretically free to marry if she chose. Most did not. The world outside the order was one they had not inhabited since childhood, and the skills required to navigate it as an ordinary Roman woman were not skills that Vestal training had provided. For all 30 years of her service, she was bound by an absolute vow of chastity. Not as a personal spiritual commitment. Not as a private sacrifice offered to the goddess. As a public and legally enforceable contract whose terms extended far beyond her own body and life, because in Roman theology, the purity of the Vestals was not merely a religious virtue. It was a load-bearing wall of the empire itself. The Romans believed, with the complete sincerity of people who have never been given reason to doubt their cosmological framework, that the safety of Rome was directly linked to the sexual purity of its Vestals. A Vestal who broke her vow did not merely commit a personal transgression. She cracked the foundation. She introduced a corruption into the sacred machinery that kept Rome protected, that maintained the divine favor on which military victories, agricultural abundance, and civic stability all depended. The implications of this theology were catastrophic for any woman accused under its terms. Because Rome was a civilization that experienced military defeats, and plagues, and famines, and political catastrophes. These things happened with the regularity that history visits upon all empires, regardless of their theological arrangements. And when they happened, the Roman populace needed an explanation. The cause. A source of corruption that could be identified, punished, and removed, after which the gods would presumably restore their favor and the disaster would end. The Vestals were a perfect target. They were few, they were visible, they were the designated guardians of Rome's divine relationship, and their guilt was, by definition, impossible to disprove, because absence of evidence was not evidence of innocence in a theological framework that simply asserted the connection between Vestal purity and Roman safety. A defeat had happened. Therefore something was wrong. And what could be wrong? Find a Vestal. Find a reason to doubt her. The logic was circular and airtight and lethal. Accusations against Vestals spiked during Rome's worst moments of crisis. The historical record makes this correlation impossible to ignore. Women who had served without incident for years would find themselves suddenly suspect in the aftermath of a military disaster, tried before the College of Pontiffs in proceedings where the burden of proof was weighted almost entirely toward condemnation, and sentenced to the punishment that Rome had devised for exactly this situation. A punishment that had been constructed, with meticulous theological care, to be as terrible as possible while maintaining Rome's fiction that it had not technically killed anyone. Roman law had a problem. A Vestal virgin was sacred. Her blood was sacred. To spill it, to execute her as Rome executed criminals, by the sword or by strangulation or by any of the other direct methods the state employed for ending lives it had decided should end, was considered a profound religious violation, a desecration that would itself bring down the divine punishment the execution was supposedly meant to avert. You could not shed her blood. The goddess would not permit it. The priests confirmed it. The legal scholars agreed. And yet she had to die. The Romans were, above all things, practical people. They had built an empire on the application of systematic thinking to complex problems, And the problem of how to kill a sacred woman without technically killing her was, in its grim way, a problem they approached with characteristic Roman thoroughness. The solution they arrived at reveals something profound and deeply disturbing about the Roman mind: its extraordinary capacity to maintain the form of a principle while completely destroying its substance. To construct a legal and theological fiction so elaborate, so internally consistent, so carefully insulated from the obvious reality it was designed to obscure, that the people operating within it could proceed without ever being forced to confront what they were actually doing. Rome would not kill her. Rome would simply place her somewhere, provide her with certain basic provisions, and then leave. What happened after that was between her and the gods. The legal and religious establishment had examined the question and determined that it bore no responsibility for outcomes it had not directly caused. It was not killing a Vestal virgin. It was conducting a religious ceremony. The semantics were perfect. The theology was airtight. And a woman was going to suffocate in a hole in the ground while Rome told itself it had kept its hands clean. The place was called the Campus Sceleratus, the evil field. It stood just inside the Colline Gate at the edge of the city, close enough to Rome that the connection to its sacred geography was maintained, far enough from the forum that what happened there could be absorbed into a particular kind of official silence. The Romans knew where it was. They knew what it was for. The name they gave it told you everything you needed to know about how they felt about what happened there, and their decision to keep happening it anyway tells you even more. On the day of execution, the condemned Vestal was placed in a closed litter. Not so that she could not be seen, so that she could not be heard. Plutarch, who described the procession with a discomfort that bleeds through his careful historical prose, noted that the litter was sealed so that no sound could emerge from it, no voice, no cry, no human sound that might pierce the formal solemnity of the proceedings and force the watching crowd to confront what it was watching. The procession moved through the streets of Rome in complete silence. Citizens lined the route. No one spoke. At the Campus Sceleratus, the litter was opened. The Vestal, who had perhaps served Rome for decades, who had tended its sacred flame, who had extended her hand and pardoned condemned men in the street, who had sat in the place of honor at the games and been saluted by senators, was led to a narrow opening in the ground. Steps descended into the earth. A small underground chamber had been prepared, and inside that chamber, Rome had placed what it considered the minimum requirements for its theological absolution: a small lamp burning with a limited supply of oil, a little bread, a little milk, a small bed, not enough to survive on, not intended to be, intended only to establish beyond theological challenge that Rome had not sent her down there to die. Rome had sent her down there with provisions. What happened to those provisions, how long they lasted, what occurred in the chamber when the lamp finally guttered and the darkness became absolute, that was not Rome's concern. That was between her and Vesta. Rome had done its part. Rome had left food. She descended the ladder. The opening was sealed above her. The procession returned to the city. And whatever happened in the Campus Sceleratus after that, the slow consumption of the lamp oil, the darkness that followed, the silence that the sealed earth maintained with perfect, suffocating completeness, was not recorded, because Rome had no interest in recording it. The recording would have required acknowledging what the provisions and the lamp and the careful theological architecture of the whole proceeding had been designed to obscure: that a woman was buried alive in the dark, alone, by the civilization that had called her sacred. The cult of Vesta endured for over 1,000 years. The Campus Sceleratus received its condemned women across the span of centuries, not frequently, not routinely, but reliably. Reliably enough that the Romans maintained the site and its procedures across generations, that the pontiffs knew the ritual and could enact it when required, that Roman law preserved the loophole with careful institutional attention. We know the names of some of them. Tuccia, accused in 230 BC. Opimia and Floronia, condemned in the aftermath of the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, when Rome was desperate enough for divine explanation that 2 women's lives were the price of cosmic reassurance. Licinia and Marcia, condemned together under Domitian, an emperor whose political use of religious prosecution was as sophisticated as it was ruthless. Their names surface in Plutarch and Livy and the elder Pliny, noted, recorded, and moved past with the same efficient brevity that Roman historical writing typically reserved for events it considered resolved. What the names cannot capture is what the theological system that produced their condemnations actually was, at its most fundamental level. The Vestal virgins are often described as the most powerful women in Rome. And in the narrow technical sense of measurable privileges, the carriage, the escort, the pardon, the property rights, that description is accurate. They possessed formal powers that no other Roman woman could claim. But power that can be revoked the moment the civilization that granted it becomes frightened is not really power. It is a performance of power, maintained at the pleasure of the institution, withdrawn the instant its continuation becomes inconvenient. The Vestals were powerful in the way that a lightning rod is powerful, elevated above everything around them, yes, but elevated specifically to absorb the strikes that might otherwise damage something more important. When Rome was calm and prosperous and victorious, the Vestals were honored. When Rome was terrified, when the legions had broken on some foreign field, when plague moved through the city's crowded streets, when the political order trembled and citizens looked for something to blame, the honor was set aside and the theological machinery of accusation and condemnation was activated with quiet, practiced efficiency. They were not the women who held the empire. They were the women the empire held, suspended between extraordinary privilege and absolute annihilation, golden enough to dazzle anyone who looked directly at them, and bound tightly enough that the first serious tremor could bring everything down. Rome's true nature was not revealed in the Colosseum, where the violence was at least honest, named, acknowledged, performed in daylight before 100,000 witnesses who understood exactly what they were watching. Rome's true nature was revealed in the Campus Sceleratus, where a woman was handed a lamp and a loaf of bread and lowered into the dark, and the most sophisticated legal and religious apparatus in the ancient world told itself, with a straight face, that it had not laid a hand on her. The flame of Vesta was finally extinguished by order of the Emperor Theodosius in 394 AD, as Christianity became the official religion of a changing empire. The Vestal order was dissolved. The sacred fire went out for the last time, untended, and Rome did not fall, not that day, not from that cause. The Campus Sceleratus became just a field. But the ground remembers what was buried in it. History does not bury its horrors because they are unimportant. It buries them because they are mirrors, and the reflection never quite goes away. This has been the Forbidden Archives. The files are never truly closed.